Welcome back to Modern Education. I'm the host of Modern Education, Benjamin S. Woodford, here in the studio with my co-host.
Hello, this is Emily Quiles. Nice to be in the studio with you, Ben, on this lovely Friday evening.
It actually feels like you mean it. Like, you actually do think that it's nice to be here in the studio with me. And
it's always a really nice way to end the week.
I feel like my week is just getting started, but it is all good because we are here again. It's Friday afternoon, 3 to 4 p.m. for your commute. This is the Modern Education Radio Hour. We're very happy if you are tuning in to listen to the show anywhere in the Bay Area or across the sea in China or anywhere else in the world that you might be. We are so excited to have you in the audience, and we hope you will come back every week to hear what we have to say and join in on the conversation as well. If you would like to hit us up on the Twitter, that's at KZSU DJ
Twitter.
Or at KZSU. Yes, those are the two Twitters that we have. We have access to the Twitter. If you do want to tweet us. Don't be a twit. Send us a tweet. Yes, we would love to hear from you. So we're going to dive right in pretty quick to the show. But first, what are we doing? What's the plan?
For today or in my life?
Oh, okay, existentially. Let's start there. What are we doing existentially? Why are we even here, right?
Oh, my goodness. That's too loaded.
Maybe we need to be a little more loaded for that question. Let's stick with the script, right?
All right.
Okay, anyway, we are super excited to have you listening in. And what are we going to tell them about today? What is our topic?
Today, it's a bit of a big topic. We're going to talk about how textbook can misrepresent our all the way from religion to race, war, conflicts, how the way that these are depicted, these conflicts or people are depicted in our textbooks can be widely misrepresented. And if you think about this in this kind of chain reaction way, he's giving me a look. No, but if you think about this in a chain reaction way, you really have more of a profound effect on how these kids, how children are socialized in schools.
Yeah.
So really, this is one of those topics where we're talking about one thing, but it's really getting at kind of how do we tell our story?
Pervasive thing, right?
A bit is.
This idea of designing the textbook or the curriculum or even the canon, if you will, right? The story that is told has a profound effect on the society which is receiving that story.
It does.
It reminds me of the old adage. It's something along the lines of history is written by the winners, right? And it's this idea that history is not a subjective thing that just happens and we put it down in a textbook. It's not that simple. And I think for me, the most quintessential example of this is the Christopher Columbus tale, right? I mean, I remember when I was a kid, it's like, in the year 1492, the Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
Yeah.
And he was this big hero, right?
Yeah.
He discovered America, which I find a little insulting now that I understand that there were already people here.
To discover something.
You can't discover a place that's already populated. That is the antithesis of discovery. You just found someone else's home.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, I visited somebody else. Like, it doesn't sound as good of a heroic story that way, but it's much more factual, right?
And that's kind of the basis of it, isn't it? Is the way that we are presented these heroes, which could be looking at different cultures, not so heroic. It could be more like the enemy. And a lot of these things is just really goes down to, the way that we shape the people who have made big
It's like the
marks
narrative,
in our history.
Right? We're creating a narrative around people who it is convenient to call them a hero. And that heroic nature gives us a bigger buy-in when we're talking about, these historical figures, and we can segment it out into an individual now. And that individual is much easier to kind of place a narrative around. And the reality is this isn't how history works, right? It's not like there were these few great people that just sort of popped up in history and we need to study them and nothing happened in between. But that certainly seems how it's presented in schools.
Yeah. I mean, so even from So we have, blah, blah, blah. You kind of gave me a lot right there.
Yeah, I kind of took off on you there. This was not on the script, people. She has a script.
I don't have a script. I have
we are
like 5
unscripted.
pages of notes that are somehow going to like be fleshed out to all of you guys.
Okay. And I have no notes at all. I just make stuff up off my vast knowledge.
Great credibility here.
Well, I do read a book a day, so it's got to count for something, right?
Yeah.
If I can't make stuff up when I'm reading a book a day, I am clearly missing what's in the books, right?
Are you reading textbooks?
No, because I find them to be not very credible, actually.
Interesting. I mean, actually, I kind of want to go into this first by I'd like to share an experience of my own when I was in the
Personal story, people. Tune
personal.
in.
So I was in the library in Los Altos, and basically I was looking at this like encyclopedia. I can't remember exactly what I was looking at, but it has something to do with the internet. And I'm so sorry. I was trying to find his name when I wanted to give this story.
Al Gore.
Yeah, it was Al Gore.
Al Gore invented the internet, I'm sure is what the story was, right?
That Al Gore invented the internet.
Yeah.
And
I saw the blank in your notes. I was like, I know who that is.
See? There we go.
It's not true, by the way. Let's just keep the misinformation off the radio. This is not the truth, but there is a rumor that Al Gore invented the internet.
Mm-hmm. And this comes from
global warming.
No. Really?
No. He did that movie about like global warming.
Yes,
it's kind of his thing. Yeah.
His thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, and
he was also vice president, I think, at one time, right?
You know so much about Al Gore. Good. A book a day.
There you go.
So basically this encyclopedia had a little post-it note inside of it and said, "This isn't true. Google it."
Right.
And I was like, okay. So I Googled it and it shows it's not true. And this is like a widely misrepresented, I guess, idea about Al Gore that was taken from a quote. And they actually quoted him in that textbook or encyclopedia of it, but it was just taken out of context, saying that he created it.
Yeah. Well, I could just as easily say I created the internet. There it is. We just said it on the radio. It's practically true, right?
Just as much as him.
Yeah. And we do stream online to the entire world. So that makes it extra true. I mean, this was just in one encyclopedia.
Yeah. I mean, that's basically getting at the basis of what is truth. Like, how do we define truth? And one of it being how many times it's repeated over and over and over.
Yeah, citations, right? I mean, that is huge in academia. We say it is credible or it is seminal work, primarily if other people said it was good, which is, actually not a bad gauge. I mean, that is kind of the basis of the peer review process.
Yeah.
Is we peer review, right? Who's reviewing it? Our peers. Who else could review it? I mean, if you could send your manuscript off to God, then you could make sure every single thing
reviewed.
Every single thing published has divine intervention to guarantee its absolute truth.
Yeah.
And that's actually what some people think about the Bible and how it was written. But I don't know. I'm not so convinced.
I mean, peer review only means only a certain amount of people read it.
Right.
Reviewed
Usually 3. That's the standard practice.
And that peer could be like not even a very representative group of the topic that you're talking about.
They may not even be experts in the field that you're writing about.
Yeah.
They may just be the only ones that you could talk into editing for that journal for that time period in time.
So
because all the editors of journals, work for free. So it's a difficult thing. I mean, people do it for prestige or credibility or, clout, right? And it does give some of those things.
But to be able to peer review,
Right. But this peer review process is largely an exercise in social validation, right?
That makes sense.
Yeah, and that's a lot of what ends up in the textbooks is if somebody can create this narrative that becomes the narrative. Doesn't matter if it's true or not. It's been said enough.
Just been said,
it's been said enough times that it becomes truth for all intents and purposes as far as what you read in the book.
Yeah, no, exactly. And when you're thinking about this in the school level of children reading these things and how they're shaping the world. I mean, for me as well, just going from an American education to a British education, you see complete differences in the way that certain stories are represented. One notably being communism, as well as World War II. And I remember learning in history class, I think it was like sophomore year in high school, and it said how America saved everyone in World War II, how we were the ones who were able to win World War II if it wasn't for us.
Yeah, that's funny because it says that in America. It also says that in England.
Oh, no. I'm just saying it says it in America.
Right,
and in England, it doesn't say that as much, that America saved us for World War II.
I think actually more likely England at some level did. They were sort of the last holdout before Germany took over all of Europe, right?
Yeah.
And America actually was very late coming into that.
Yes.
We stayed out of it for a very long time. Really, I think it was FDR was in office at the time, and I think the only reason he actually helped is because he had a really good relationship with Winston Churchill.
That's
and
right.
he asked him to, right?
Yeah.
And that's a funny thing to think about, that Nazis could have won the war very easily if we wouldn't have got off our hands near the end. Mm-hmm. And that's, I don't think that's the common narrative that you're going to see in the textbooks, right?
I mean, I remember hearing a lot about the very nationalist tones that we had during that time, the isolationist policies, that was kind of just more of an ideology at the point, which I would almost argue we're seeing now, the increasing isolationists. We need to protect our borders.
Yeah, let's build a wall, right?
Rather than help, or how do we
let's ignore all the statistics about how people actually come here. Let's just isolate ourselves by building a wall that makes us feel safer.
Yeah.
And I don't even know who that would make feel safer, actually. I don't even know. What is up with that anyway? Is this government shutdown thing still happening?
It is. It's still happening.
Okay, let's not get off topic too much. I know we love tangents here in modern education. Maybe, are we going tangential here?
This is a good tangent, honestly, because I was listening to this podcast earlier this morning, and it was just saying how the lady that was being interviewed, she was just like, oh, well, at least they're talking now. Like, at least there's being discussions. I'm like, at least? Like, right. And she's just like, she was talking about it so positively, like, finally we're doing it, like, we're talking, blah, blah, blah. I'm just like, talking isn't much.
Yeah.
Like,
shouldn't we have done the talking before the shutdown? Yeah, isn't that kind of how it's supposed to work, right?
And we now have 2 paychecks that is not gone to families.
I have never been so glad not to be a government worker.
Yeah. Honestly,
right?
You don't have security. And this is actually being talked about a lot. And I think it was the Coast Guard that people were saying, I don't have security at this point for my family. I don't know what to do. Shout
out to all the coasties, by the way. We love that you protect our borders. We love the people who are doing good work, really trying to take care of the country and the people who live in it, right? And it's not your fault. No. We don't blame any of the hardworking men and women who are suffering because of this. I feel like there's just one person really to blame.
I'd say so too.
I mean, we don't have to mention, that guy.
One person and all of his, I guess he's the puppet. So all of his conductors.
Yeah, it's Vladimir Putin, right? That's who we're talking about here.
Russia. I don't know.
We're going to be attacked by Russian trolls. Look out.
Anyway, that's a good way to go on to the next thing.
Moving on.
No, okay. So I'd like to get a little bit more background to how a textbook is made. Like, what is it that gets textbooks out? And from what I've kind of gathered is that the 2 leading states in the U.S. that kind of manage textbooks is Texas and California.
Okay, the biggest states.
Yeah. Which makes sense because you have a lot more money coming out of them. So it kind of ends up like where if they're producing a lot of the textbooks, a lot of people will just follow because of that mass production.
Well, sure. They have more money probably to put into the textbooks in the first place. And it is quite an undertaking, not to discount, regardless of the content of the book, the work to put together a textbook is quite extensive, between coming up with original content. I mean, I'm of course, it's me. I'm thinking math textbooks, but we should be thinking history textbooks, right? But the work it takes to do the research, the time and energy, the expertise that goes into constructing a coherent story. I mean, that is, voluminous, voluminous. Yeah.
Both.
Yeah. Voluminous. I think like my hair.
Yeah. But it's a lot of work. And even then I genuinely have no clue what that would look like. Trying to put together a bunch of history and try to represent it well. As a journalist, I know putting out 500 words on one story is very difficult to know that you're not misrepresenting.
Right.
It's something that you should be aware of when you do your work, but it can oftentimes not be the case.
Right,
and that's just, I think, one of the fallacies or one of the misfortunes of human communication. You just have multiple sides, so basically, so we have the Board of Education. So you have the Texas Board of Education, California Board of Education, and those are the two main state Board of Education. But then you have the overarching U.S. Board of Education.
Right.
And they establish like what curriculum, all the way to how religions are influenced, how or are represented, how wars are represented, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, I found this a bit interesting that there were 3 consultants who recommended emphasizing, and this is from Texas, emphasizing the roles in the Bible, Christianity, and civic virtue of religion. And these are the people like on the board who decide what passes as a credible textbook.
Sure. And you got to think when you hear that, or when you even think about that we are talking about a multinational melting pot of a country with every religion, race, creed, every single type of person represented here. And that does not come out in the textbooks that we put into our public schools. And I don't even think it's really attempted to be. And even, these kind of observations about really this very strong Christian ethic being embedded within the educational system, it's hard to fight it. There's a historical precedent there that is something that has been happening for a long time. And sadly, that seems to be enough to justify it.
I mean, this country has had very strong, deep roots with Christianity, and what it means all the way back to conquering what it meant to be the U.S.
Sure.
It was all through religious background. And it seems, because ultimately we have this idea of separation of church and state. And as well, in one of the research that I found, they were saying how church and state separation is actually extremely downplayed in our textbooks. It's not talked about that much. It's just kind of mentioned or kind of put around, but there's still that very strong Christian value put to politics, anything, to history textbooks.
Sure,
it's not taken out. So...
Hey,
we have a caller.
We got a call coming in. We will not answer it at the moment, but we appreciate your call. You should definitely text us, 855-723-9010. We'd love to hear from you. And if anyone else is in the studio, grab that phone call. Anyway, so we're thinking about and we're talking about what really goes into these textbooks, right? Now, I'm reminded, I'm going to share a little personal story, and this is a little embarrassing for me, but this is before I considered myself thoughtful enough to know better. And so I had a class, right? I had a class at junior college when I was still working my way, trudging through the trenches of junior college, which was a great experience, by the way. And I had this history class, and the teacher assigned us Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. And this book is, revolutionary. It is a complete 180 from the traditional textbooks. And it's truly an amazing book. I've since gone back and read it a couple of times. And every time I read it, I'm just like, oh, this book is so insightful and depressing and amazing and sad and everything all the stories that you wish you would have actually known are in there. But I didn't know this at the time. And I remember my very first assignment in the class. The teacher assigned, read the first chapter and talk about the event that happened. I don't even remember which event it was at the moment, but I was not a great student at the moment. Or I didn't even realize what the book was. Like, I'd never heard of it and didn't realize that it wasn't just every other history book. So instead of reading the chapter, I just went online and looked up the event. And so I wrote my homework assignment about this event with the popular narrative of the historical account that you would read in regular textbooks. And my teacher gives me the paper back. She's like, please redo this. You clearly didn't read the chapter. And I was like, yeah, that's true. I thought this would be good enough, but clearly the story in the chapter must be different than the rest of the story.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember doing that typical, like looking up online events. I've had similar situation where unfortunately you can find anything online, but it's completely separate.
Yeah. Just because you find a story online doesn't make it credible, right? And even if it's somewhat credible, it doesn't mean it's the whole story. And that was the lesson that I really learned that day, because I went back and I did read the chapter.
What was different about that textbook from online?
I should not make noises like that into the mic, but that was the exasperation of the difference. I mean, when I went online, it was like, sure, I can talk about this and that, and there's just a few facts that fit historically, and they weren't necessarily wrong. But then I went back and read Howard Zinn's account of it, and he gave, the indigenous people's side of it, and he gave, the victim's side of it, and he gave the stories behind why it actually happened, not just sort of the heroic account of certain people, right? And it completely changed my outlook as far as, where I can look for facts and how important it is to really know your source. Because without a credible source, and without a source that you can maybe hope to trust has some kind of completeness in the story, or at least isn't purposely obfuscating certain parts of the story. I love that word, by the way. I think I try to use it every week if I can. But
I think you used it last week.
Yeah. It's the best word. It really is. I got all the good words.
All right.
I think that's a Trump line. I feel horrible for using a Trump line, but I just think it was funny at that moment. Anyway, so... I learned a valuable lesson in this about not just taking at face value the first thing you find on the internet, and more importantly, doing my homework.
Yeah.
Like, for real. Do your homework, people. Like, don't
That's when he knew he wanted to be a teacher.
I know, it was a little after. But either way, it was a great experience. I'm glad the teacher let me redo the work. I think that's a signal of a good teacher, that if they know you didn't learn it, they're not just going to give you an F and move on. I'm taking a tangent on this, but I feel like it's worth it.
It's true.
It's powerful, to give someone the opportunity to make up their mistakes. It's like, I think being a teacher is largely a labor of love. And love is, one of those things where you can say that you care. That's not love. Love is like actually trying to understand the person that you're helping or with or caring for. And in the context of being a teacher, I think that largely means second chances. That largely means, compassion and understanding. And when a teacher says, oh, you got an F, you're done. What they're really saying is, I don't have time to give you any more attention. I don't really care if you learned it or not. And the point of this was not for you to learn, but it was for me to grade you. And that is not something any teacher, I think, or any thoughtful teacher would say out loud on purpose. But they don't, I think many teachers have not taken the time or had the opportunity to stop and say, wait a second. This is the subtext of what I'm doing. This is the underlying meaning of the way I'm running this. And, for parents, it can be the same thing. You have the power to influence the way your kid interprets what's happening in their classroom. And if your kid comes back with an F and they feel real distraught about it, or want to hide it and put it under their their mattress, or hide whatever. I think kids put different things under the mattress, don't they? Yeah, that was weird.
Wherever you hide that.
You adults know what I'm talking about, especially the males. But the point is, I think that trying to sweep these things under the rug as a teacher or a parent really does the kid a disservice. And a parent can easily dissuade a kid from interpreting what the teacher's doing by just simply being interested. And that's something that I think all the parents out there, if you're listening right now, driving home from picking up your kids at school, understand that you love your kids, and we don't doubt that. We would never, ever doubt whether or not you love your kids. But you have to show that interest in them, and that means being the cushion between them and a bad teacher, which they will inevitably have.
Yes.
You cannot get your kid through public school, or maybe even private school, most of them, without them occasionally having a teacher that just does not see the implications of the way they run their classroom.
Sorry, I got distracted because I think we got a tweet.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks for I can't read it.
we love when people tweet into us.
That's
I
really
think
nice.
That's your mom.
Is it?
I think so. Yeah, she's the best.
It is my mom. Hi, Mom.
You know, I think my mom and your mom are our biggest fans.
Definitely are.
That is a beautiful thing. And I think, you know, if anyone was going to be my biggest fan, I think my mom would be one of them.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. If there was someone else out there who like wanted to be my biggest fan, I would like that too.
Yeah, if you want to add a +1.
Yeah. If you're out there listening right now and you are not my mom, but you would like to be my biggest fan, yeah, just text in 855-723-9010. We always love to hear from you here on Modern Education Radio Hour, Fridays from 3 to 4 p.m. for your commute. Where are we going next, Emily Quiles?
I would like to go into this by kind of looking at the multiple perspectives. The idea of a multiple perspective is just inevitable when we're talking about history or like any story. If you think about it on an individual level,
Sure.
Of like, okay, I went to go get coffee. My perspective to go get coffee is way different than the person who served my coffee, for example.
Yeah, because they have served like 100 cups in a row and you're just getting one and sitting down with your latte.
Exactly.
And they're like, I've had just about enough of this for the day.
I'm tired of making lattes.
I've done a little, but I feel like I've done a latte.
I've done a latte.
You see my pun there? That was a dumb pun. That's how I roll.
So this idea of multiple perspectives, we should really get into our, like, when we're talking about history, to understand that there is, how are these multiple perspectives understood in textbooks? Do we, and as well to pose the question, do we need a single national narrative or do we need multiple? Which is kind of what's happening in the multiple perspectives. We are having multiple textbooks which say different things.
And I think that's beautiful. I think the single national narrative is a scary idea.
It is, especially in our
terrifying,
country being so big.
Right.
But I do believe it should have standards because the things that we see widely misrepresented are within wars where we see like the hero, like we're saying before, who is the hero, but as well as casualties. The way that a lot of textbooks talk about casualties in war as just American tragedies, not foreign tragedies. You'll see personal accounts, which is something that recently, in the 1970s after Vietnam War, there was more of a pull in being more individual, being more about these personal accounts of soldiers who suffered.
Do you think there's a reason behind that? Like, is there a logic to shifting the narrative from sort of the factual account down to a single individual's story?
I think it has one to do with technology. So the access to these things, so the access to be able to have soldier accounts, as well as the overall view of war in whatever country. So before, war was seen as something necessary, and then after Vietnam War, it was typically seen as why. Like, why are we fighting in wars?
It was definitely not a popular war, and I think I don't know if there's been a popular war since, honestly.
And I think that's really the turn of the century, which is what some academics have coined it as, I suppose. The turn of the century feeling of war was, at least what they're saying, marked by post-Vietnam. And I think that has to do with the overall feeling that we had about war. And so, I mean, talking about that, we have just inevitably this big dichotomy between nationalism and individualism. So how much do individualism being about one person, nationalism being about a group, like one society. And so nationalism is basically the identification of one's own nation and the support for its interests, and an individual being for yourself, basically.
I feel like we are largely skewed towards the individualist side at this point. I don't see a lot of kind of common national identity. I think there's pockets of different national identities depending on where you go. And I think we still have a sort of a long-standing narrative about the national identity of America, which I don't think is actually a true narrative. I think it's sort of the story we've painted about land of the free, home of the brave, land of opportunity, right? And statistics don't back that up. The statistics do not show that everybody has opportunity here. It is still possible. And the narrative is that if you work hard and if you put in the time and the energy and the effort and you start your own business and all these things, you can and will be successful, and then you'll be one of the elite. Now, I've been reading this like compelling book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed lately, and he was really
sounds interesting.
Oh, it's powerful, wow. Yeah. And he's talking about how essentially this narrative of you can be one of the rich people, you can be successful, is essentially a strategy to keep people either oppressed because they think that they deserve to be the underling or the unhappy, whatever. I'm losing my words here, but they deserve to be the poor person, right? So they don't blame society for their position. And then the other side of that is when people actually do get ahead, now they're in a place where they need to fight to protect their position. So they actually end up becoming the oppressors by nature of simply trying to get to not be oppressed. And that's a powerful struggle that just seems to keep going and going and going.
It is.
Yeah.
I mean, and speaking of, it kind of goes into one of the other topics I wanted to talk about, like you're saying, is race. So the way that slavery is seen or depicted in the Deep South is way different than what we're seeing in California. And one of them in reference of, so we have government archives which contain bills of sale of slaves. Sorry.
Sure.
And basically they have kind of like whitewashed these ideas, and instead of talking about slavery as selling people, they have made it as like a trade, kind of just trading goods and services.
Sure.
And that is typically the Atlantic triangular trade, which is kind of like the stamp of understanding, like kind of the whitewash version of talking about race.
It's a euphemism, right? It's a way of making the trade itself, the things that are actually happening, sound less offensive. We put a fancy title on it. We make it sound like it's a nice, happy thing. And it makes, even if you know what it really is, it makes it feel less horrible to the people who have to live with themselves, right? Yeah.
There's two of those ideas. So PC culture, politically correct, or harsh reality.
Sure. Yeah.
I think both of them need to be balanced in an argument like this. And really, it's not easy to really talk about all the time. But I think if we were to represent a reality that is both harsh and representative, you can go a lot further than what a lot of academics have coined or said as whitewashing.
Yeah. And it does a disservice to everybody. It's like when you give a certain piece of the story and don't let people see both sides and let people understand kind of what they're actually dealing with, even the people who are benefiting from it are living ignorantly with really not a clear understanding of how much they are affecting other people. And I think a big piece of this, kind of on the very fundamental level, is the monetization of people. And when we can talk about people as a monetary value, even whether they're slaves or not, when we can distill down the value of a human being to some sort of dollar amount or some sort of statistic on paper, it dehumanizes the people that we're talking about and allows us to kind of think of it from this top-down sort of bird's eye ruler type view. Yeah. Right? You ever think about a map? To look at a map is the perspective of God. You are looking down from above. And this is actually the perspective of the rulers who first started making maps, is they wanted to look down on the people as if they were gods. And so they wanted a bird's eye view to be able to, plot things out and really look at it impersonally, right? And this was a practice that is largely understood in the scholarship to be a practice of dehumanizing the people actually on the ground.
Yeah. And it's just It's
You should
terrible.
see her face, ladies and gentlemen. She has got
always my
this face of like, oh, it really is terrible. She's saying terrible, but her face is like terrible. I think I've distracted you from your 5 pages of notes. I'm just going to talk for a minute while you recompose yourself.
No, you're fine.
And we will just come right back here with the next thing. You keep going. I'm
keep going? I keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, one thing that I found interesting was kind of what they're saying, like the Civil War, the North versus the South.
Sure.
And this kind of one case study that I looked at was how the North and the South represented the history in the North and South currently of Civil War.
Okay.
And basically this is the Reconstruction period, post-Civil War, that they were looking at. And the way that they talk about the Reconstruction period is actually really interesting. So in the South, they actually have downplayed it by saying that how do I say this? That these books that they were empowering corrupt, oversexed African Americans is what I have on my notes, which is really, it was.
Well, that was one of the big stereotypes. I mean, it continues to be one of the big stereotypes about African Americans. And I think it is one of those tales that the white people used as a way to demonize black men specifically. Mm-hmm. And the stereotype went something along the lines of, black women are overly sexual, and that's why it was okay to take advantage of them.
Exactly.
And black men were kind of feminized to the point where they didn't need or want sexual relations. So they were essentially blocked from a lot of their sexual freedom. Mm-hmm. And that became sort of flipped once we got to civil rights. And people were liberated and people were having a lot more freedom. And this is not even just civil rights, even the early 1900s. And you look at blues music in particular, there's a lot of stories in these songs and music from the time about traveling, because traveling was not allowed, and sexual freedom, because that was not allowed either. So these became the narratives that African Americans had built up for themselves after essentially having these fundamental human rights stripped from them, to the point where there were all these misconceptions, right?
Yeah. And just as well, like they were saying how the driving forces behind the conflict of the North and South, the South depicted it as that it was just economics, power, politics, greed, and domination of Northern interest. There's like no mention of slavery.
Sure.
Which is just strange to me to hear that they're looking at it from this like economical, analysis, not humanitarian.
Sadly, I think that happened on both sides pretty readily. My understanding is that even the Emancipation Proclamation and Abraham Lincoln's push to create that new idea in American culture, or within the wartime culture, was really an economic pull to try to change the tide of the war. And the reality, I believe, or as far as I recollect, if this is correct, if not, you can text 855-723-9010 and give me a little slap in the hand for being misquoting here. But I believe the basic idea was that creating the Emancipation Proclamation was more an economic hit to the South's ability to wage war. And, many of the South soldiers were African Americans that were being forced to fight. And creating this sort of this document that created a way out or gave the promise of freedom, all of a sudden created, a huge unrest that really stirred things up. And so Abraham Lincoln was not trying to be the great savior.
Which is represented sometimes in our history books.
Sure,
I remember that from high
yeah.
school, it being presented as like the savior for slavery. Which is, it's not talked about behind the scenes.
It's much more convenient to tell that story. It gives us a hero. And I'm not saying, Abraham Lincoln was a great man. He did so many wonderful things, and he really did have a huge arc in his own life as far as from where he started to where he ended up. And that's something to admire. Like, I'm not discounting that at all. I actually admire him personally, but that is not to say that he had purely, benevolent intentions in what he did. And it was largely an economic choice, a way of trying to turn the tides of the war that had very little to do with trying to emancipate the people. That it was,
which is unfortunately a lot of the in higher up positions, especially the president. The only actual reason why they do anything is financial, not humanitarian.
Sure, yeah. We could talk about that all day. We should do a show on that.
We sure could. Well, I kind of stemming off also to other countries to give more how this isn't just the U.S. This is everyone trying to redefine their history to show we're not terrible people. And I found one that was interesting, which actually split West Germany and East Germany, where West Germany, they changed over time as historians that analyzed the Nazi regime as national educational officials instead of Nazis. And
that's a euphemism right there. That sounds. I don't even feel very offended at that. National education officials. I want to be one of those.
Yeah, it sounds something nice.
Wait, that's a Nazi? No, I don't want to be one of those.
No.
It just sounds so good the way you put it, though.
I mean, that's the point exactly. So, and then you have in East Germany, and they also in this study they also looked at Japan, and these textbooks hardly changed at all any of the presentation of fascism in World War II. So you itself in Germany have this strong divide. In West Germany, you have where they're trying to cover it up, make it look nice, and East Germany, which is trying to push more towards, okay, this is what's happened.
Right.
We don't want to repeat this. And that is also one of the concerns when we're talking about textbooks, to not repeat.
There's a famous saying, right?
Yes.
Those who don't learn from their past are doomed to repeat it.
Exactly.
And I think that is such a powerful thing, especially when we're talking about, nationalism and racism and elitism and all these things. And I think that lesson is kind of a poignant one for us to remember right now in this country, because we've been through so much and we've come so far from where we were. I mean, we have so much work to do, but I do get the distinct feeling that right now we've been backsliding. Maybe not every individual, right? But I think as a nation, we are beginning to backslide, and we're beginning, maybe even we are well on our way backsliding to, go back to these ways of racism and segregation and all these things that racism's not gone. We'd like to say, plenty of people would tell you, oh, racism's over. That's that ended in the 80s or 70s or 60s or whatever, right? Yeah. That is not the case. It has never been the case. And most likely in our lifetimes, it never will be the case. But there's a big difference between saying racism is gone and just rolling over and let it take over again, right? And I do get the feeling that there's a real danger that we could backslide to a place that none of us really want to be. And that's scary to me.
We have two very opposite sides of an argument trying to get, even going to the government shutdown, trying to get something to work. Two very opposite sides of, I feel like it goes across from economic, political, social. Everything is widely divided. This might be, I'm young, so I haven't seen that much history of my own life experience, but at least I can say.
But you go to the library.
Yes. I was at least going to say, that from my understanding of textbooks to now, that it seems like now is a lot worse than before. But minus the actual casualties. That's one thing. Because we are seeing less war, but more problems.
See, I don't even think we're seeing less war. I think we're just seeing less of the war.
That's, yeah.
You know, I mean, there was is a war in Afghanistan for so long. I barely saw any of it. I mean, when I was a kid in the early 90s and Desert Storm was going on, it was on TV. I mean, you saw the war. I remember watching, you know, videos of smart bombs being dropped on who knows who on TV when I was a kid, right? I'm watching TV, watching smart bombs being dropped on villages, and that was not uncommon, right? And now it's almost like the powers that be have discovered that showing what's happening and talking about the war gives people a chance to not like it or to create some sort of conversation around it. So if we just don't put it on TV at all, just sort of sweep it under the rug, whatever military things we're doing, which we are constantly doing military actions all over the world. I mean, there are people that live in countries that live in fear of drones because we just fly over and practically indiscriminately use our drones because it's clean on our side, right? Nobody has to write home about a soldier or a pilot that got shot down. Nobody has
just a drone.
Yeah. Nobody has to face.
That is the scary part of the future of our wars.
Right. Absolutely. And it is definitely one of those things where I think just because we don't hear about it as much doesn't mean it's not still happening. I mean, there's this, I think the book's called Economic Hitmen. And this isn't necessarily war, but we actively send people into other countries and create situations where we can essentially take over other countries' economies. And we have people that do this as their entire life's work. They go into countries that are economically disadvantaged or vulnerable, and they will offer, let's give you $10 million to create your entire crop as bananas. Now, that may sound great, right? We're bailing them out. We're paying them well to go into like a monoculture of farming. But what the effect of that is they become dependent on us. Because when you have a country that is not diversified in its production, then it needs to trade. And if they don't have the means and the venue or the avenues and the trade routes to be able to make that trade happen, then guess who the hero is that comes in and fixes it for them?
America.
It's America, right. And so we create countries that are dependent on us to buy their sole export. And then we, control the way they get imports to the point where we now own that country. Not through violence, not through going in and doing conquest. And, we're not doing like the British anymore and just going and taking over a country and stripping their culture. What we're doing instead is we're economically pushing them to a point where they are so dependent on us that we have no choice, they have no choice but to depend on us.
This is known as soft power, hard power.
Sure.
So soft power being not with violence, kind of through a little bit more manipulative tactics to get you to sway a certain country a certain way. And then hard power being violence.
Right. I remember, I forget the name, but it was a high-ranking general saying something along the lines of, we need to be using our soft power more to settle and to stay away from the problems that are happening around the world. Because the reality is, if we don't use our soft power effectively, then we have to use force, right? And he basically said, if we're not working with people and working with institutions and working with governments in meaningful ways, then I need to buy more ammo because that's the only other option.
And that is more of like the neoliberal view where you have these institutions, world institutions, which will keep us accountable and like have like those conversations between countries as opposed to, warfare. Yeah, you're laughing at because of the board.
We've got some nice texts coming in. I love people.
I know.
Oh my gosh. We do have our biggest fan, and it may or may not be either of our moms. But I would like to clear up for someone who would like a little clarification on obfuscation. What does that mean? To obfuscate is to hide something, maybe to push it under the rug or to skew it so it's not exactly clear. Like maybe when they have somebody doing an interview on TV that doesn't want to be identified, they will obfuscate their face by blurring it out or shadowing them. So there's a little modern education for you. And to my former student, Casey, who's listening, keep listening. Keep that dial.
Hello, Casey.
Keep that dial right here on 90.1 KZSU Stanford and modern education every Friday from 3 to 4 p.m.
That's so sweet.
I know. Do we have something specific? I thought you had a guest or something you wanted to bring in here. Do we even have time for that anymore?
We have a little bit of time.
Have you seen the clock? Can you believe how fast this hour goes by?
It always goes so quick.
That's because it's so much fun chatting together, isn't it? Yeah.
Talking about textbooks. But if we want to get into this quickly, basically, this is where I started out with this idea of looking at textbooks because I did an article about this family who is Hindu, and she has 2 children. And so you're introduced world religions in 6th grade, I believe. And she knew that this was the case, and she looked at her children's textbooks and saw some big issues. So I took some sound clips from my interview. I apologize about the background sounds. But
if it sounds horrible, we'll just cut it off.
Yeah.
So you can text us at 855-723-9010 and let us know if your speakers are popping. And so should we just let the clip run? You want to set it up any more than that? Or
let's run it.
Okay. So listen here. We have a primary stakeholder being a parent with a bit of know-how and knowledge about this particular topic, about the inconsistencies within the textbook. And I believe she was Hindu?
Yes, but her grandmother moved here. So
okay,
a couple generations down.
So we're trying to give a little bit of context as to maybe the lens where they're coming from, not a judgment about anybody's background, right?
No, not at all.
Yeah, we wouldn't do that. This is modern education, not archaic education.
Archaic.
The first introduction to Indian Hinduism that students get in California is in the 6th grade.
Okay.
And so kind of knowing that this had been an issue, I actually, when Geisha brought his textbook home in the beginning of the school year, I flipped forward to the segment on the unit on India and Hinduism. Mm-hmm. And it was really quite disturbing. Number one, actually, the length of that unit compared to other units in the book was relatively short. So considering, the many contributions to humanity that Hinduism in India has made, it was disproportionately short. And there were a lot of inaccuracies. There was a lot of focus on caste system, and I think that is one of the greatest misconceptions about Hinduism, that caste is inherent in Hindu philosophy, which is not true. Certainly the social evil of caste-based discrimination exists not only in India, but I think really all over the world. And unfortunately, it has been tied in with Hinduism. Mm-hmm. But if you go back to Hindu scripture, there's actually nothing in Hindu scripture that warrants or supports discrimination. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's the opposite. It says the opposite, that every life is divine, no matter what your birth is or no matter what your social stature is, that all life is divine. Mm-hmm. I mean, even just the photographs in the book, again, India is a developing country. There is poverty there. So not to close a blind eye, to have a blind eye to the realities that exist there. But that seemed to be the focus in some of the chapter, is the poverty, and even the photographs of people like picking out of garbage, piles. Whereas there's also like deep history and beautiful architecture and... Yeah, right.
Honestly, yeah. Why isn't that
right?
Shown
the contributions to science. The whole math, the concept of zero and the decimal system that was created. So going from Geisha's book, so that was 2015, 14. So 2015-16 school year to 2017-18 school year. There was a vast improvement, and they did switch from. I know it's a lot easier to make edits and switch in an online format now, as opposed to buying new actual textbooks. Yeah. And we are lucky that we are in a school district that has the resources to do that.
Okay, what a wonderful, wonderful little clip there. I wish we could have got through the whole thing, but we
Short
didn't.
on time.
And that's what happens when you do live radio and you're having a good time. So there's nothing wrong with that. Now, I want to thank you for tuning in. If you are listening to us in California Bay Area, on the airwaves on 90.1 KZSU Stanford, or streaming online from New York to Hong Kong, anywhere in between that you are listening, we are streaming worldwide on the web at kzsu.stanford.edu/live, and we'd love for you to tune in no matter where you are. I think this is it for us here at Modern Education for another week, and we will be back next week with a fresh interview, I believe, in the studio, right?
That is right.
The next couple of weeks, we're going to have some great interviews. Hope you will continue to tune in. Keep that dial on 90.1 everywhere you go. Don't touch it. And we'll be back next week with more Modern Education.